In Canto 3 of the Fairy Queen, we have a lot of history and genealogy and dynastic lineage, which you shouldn't pay that much attention to because it's not real. It is fake history. It is, rather, it is the imaginary history of the British that the English people in Spenser and Shakespeare's lifetime still held dear, in Chaucer's lifetime too. It was widely held to be true. It was in the history books. It is totally made up. History was not yet the science we now know it to be. And the standards of history that we now found in, say, the history department or even in the English department did not obtain. So a lot of Britamart's ancestors are made up pre-Christian British kings, or rather pre-English British kings, and so are her descendants. One of the tips that this is not real is that this dynasty involves Britomart, who's made up. It's also delivered by Merlin, who is also made up. As those two examples suggest, there are some of these people that Spenser made up himself, Britomart, a couple others, the totally fictional Queen Angela of the Saxons, and people who are part of that phony history heritage, this mythological history, which isn't about what really happened in early British history, but about what the English want to believe happened, how they want to see themselves in the world. Those characters, King Lear is one of them. Shakespeare's King Lear is one of those people. Blottoed various other people. You get in Vortimer, Arthur himself, all come in there. In a world where King Arthur is considered historical, this is where you get to the trouble. And characters like Merlin are being taken from that mythological history. And then Spenser's adding a few bonus characters of his own because what's the harm? If it strikes you as pathetic that a country would invent an imaginary history just to make itself feel better about the world, as the British did, they got this idea from the Romans. In fact, they have pretty much the same imaginary history. They link it to the Romans. It's like this. The Romans, back in the day, felt kind of left out of all that Greek culture. They were a newer nation. They're a newer empire. They didn't have the same traditions. They felt very culturally inferior to the Greeks. That's why they took over a lot of Greek art, religion, philosophy, literature. And so they made up for themselves a fictional history which tied them into that classical tradition. We aren't left out of Homer. We're Trojans. So yeah, the Trojans got beat, but but what if one Trojan prince got away and came to Italy? Huh? Wouldn't that be great? And yeah, that's our ancestor. This is actually the foundation of the great Latin epic, the Aeneid by Virgil, one of the prime models that Spenser is imitating in the Fairy Queen. In the same way, in the Middle Ages, with our man Geoffrey of Monmouth, a kind of pseudo-historian, we get an elaborate British pseudo-history which also deals with refugee Trojan princes finding their way to Britain and killing giants and whatnot. In fact, those people are tied into Aeneas. There's a fictional Brutus, founder of Britain. Okay. All of this to say is, don't get hung up in the details. They're imaginary. What is interesting is the political needs and cultural needs that are driving this myth. It's not history, it's mythology, national mythology. And Spenser is nothing if not a nationalist mythographer who wants to create new myths for England to understand its place in the world and move on to national greatness. Britomart is part of that myth making. Your notes come right up to explaining, but don't explain the difference between Britons and the English. We now use Britons to mean everybody, English, Scottish, Welsh, so some of the Irish, those people in the British Isles or on the island of Great Britain. It originally means a Celtic people who were there before the Angles and Saxons, before the English, arrived. The Romans knew the Britons, not the English. The English are Germanic people who come later. This is interesting. This is interesting to Spenser because Queen Elizabeth I, the queen to whom this poem is dedicated, is partly Welsh. She's from a newer dynasty that is related to the earlier English kings, but is also Welsh, and therefore is not called Welsh, but called a Briton, part of a unifying pre-English Britishness. This is why Britamart's armor is carefully English. It comes from the mythical Angela, whose name sounds like angel, but also sounds like Anglia, England, and a British lance made by one of like these Geoffrey of Monmouth mythological British kings. It's about myth. It's about national patriotism. It's not about the literal truth. Don't get hung up.